As you continue to meditate, turn completely inward to that point from which you apprehend all of reality. What is that in consciousness that apprehends the sensory information, the mental objects, the subtleties of language that interprets the signs given by God? That is aware of birth and existence and death and the return. From where do you perceive? Where do you abide? While the body moves and the mind churns and the constant flow of time and of learning, of change, and of the process of creation and destruction rotates around you. And what is it that perceives and calls itself I? Parameshwaraya. Allah. Jehovah. Buddha. Parabrahman. Parashakti. Namah Shivaya. Om Shivoham. Aham, aham. Om Tat Sat. Namaste. We are gathered here for another satsang, for another effort to be in truth, to be with truth, to speak truth, to hear truth, to understand it truthfully without distortion, to embody truth and to transcend the body in the fullness of truth. And to understand the whole body of truth, which cannot be understood with words. So the satsang is really an impossibility, but an essential impossibility that must be realized by realizing the impossibility of the paradox of what we are, that could only be manifested the way it manifests because of the almighty nature of the Creator, who has brought this paradox of time and eternity into wholeness. Because the truth is both relative and absolute, as we are. And the truth consists of both light and dark, as do we all. And the truth consists of both creation and destruction. And the truth concerns both being and nothingness. Can we contain the truth in our being unless we have realized our nothingness? This satsang takes place at a particular moment in history in which the arc of the cycle of time is reaching now toward the midnight moment. And we pass from creation and sustenance into the darkness of destruction and then into new creation. It is the most auspicious moment and the most dreadful and terrifying. And so if we are to speak truth in this moment that is relevant to this moment and is not an idealistic offering of flowers at a funeral, but to understand the nature of the resurrection that must be involved in the death of a civilization and a world, in order to understand its divine structure, in order for the revelation of the whole purpose and meaning of what has gone before and what is imminent to occur and what must come hereafter, and what lies beyond, and what lies within, to be able to coherently tie all of that together, we must realize the absolute and ultimate truth that is also beauty and terror and death, and the death of death. And we must be able to face this with all three eyes open. two words come to mind in describing the time that we are now in. I'll write them on the board because they have some significance etymologically. The two words that I think most describe this historic moment from the perspective of the external operations of karma and destiny and the mode of the process of transformation in terms of the engines of those who are producing the effects phenomenally within the world. Those words are perversion and cataclysm. But let's analyze these words because they have become clichés. Per verse. Per means by. Verse means turn. So one who has a perverse psychological structure is one who by turns shows a different face to the other. One can turn toward the other with love, one can turn away. One can turn toward the other with hatred, one can turn away. But the perversion is always turning, it is rotating, so that there is never a constant face, a constant other, a constant object, a constant relationship that can be depended upon. But it is also that by which one changes the version of oneself that is emergent to the world. And so there is a positive side to this archetype, because are we not always changing the face that we present and the face that we perceive inwardly, in that inner mirror that we look upon in the moments of midnights in our lives? And so there is a very rapid acceleration in the turning, in the morphing of the morphogenetic field, and the collapse of expectations of what had been taken for granted in the past has now turned into another version of itself. In some cases, a more monstrous version, but for some, a more angelic version. And then cataclysm. Kata comes from kata in the Greek. Okay. So, thank you. Although we take a cataclysm to be some awful destruction, the word kata actually comes from the Greek and it means complete, a complete act, a complete set, a complete revelation, as in a catalog of all the books in a library, for example. It contains all. Klism or kleisma from the Greek means cleansing. So the world is going through a complete cleansing, a complete purification. Kata can also mean down. It is being washed down the drain. But it is being washed down as an act of purification, so that something new can be arisen. But this complete cleansing or purification is required because of the perversion, and because that perversion has created versions of humanity that have become inhuman, subhuman. And has created social organizations in which corruption has taken over righteousness and enslavement over freedom and oppression over service. And so the world is being rebalanced in this moment. But because what we consider to be a world is nothing but the projection of consciousness, it is our consciousness that must be cleansed completely now from all that is unreal, from all that is perverse, from all that has become impure, from all that has become identified with the projection of form and has forgotten its source in the real, in the light, in God, in what must be very carefully referred to as the self. Carefully, sacredly, and with fear and trepidation of not assuming the wrong definition for that word and using it to justify an ego that is only a shadow of the self. It is because the world has become a world of shadows, of darkness, of negative projections, that this cleansing down has become necessary. But the washing down is accompanied by the ascension upward of the consciousnesses who will voluntarily cleanse themselves before the cataclysmic denouement, before the climax of the event, of the singularity. And so it is incumbent upon us, whether we are seekers or finders or verifiers or mercifiers, whatever level, stage, realm of the process of consciousness we have moved through and are ascending into, whatever it may be, sinner, saint, prophet, or liberated realizer of the one self, our mode of transmission must be one of absolute humility and peace. Because everyone in the world today is in need of peace. Peace that passeth the understanding of the ego mind. Peace that enables the heart to let go of its distress and trepidation. The peace that can only be offered by the bedrock of the real, that is not affected by the changes produced by time. The world is sustained through different processes in different phases of its immersion and self-manifestation. But in that final period called Kali Yuga, humans have chosen to learn through suffering. And indeed, it is through suffering alone that we gain spiritual knowledge. It is suffering that, if we use it properly, will make us wise. But if suffering brings knowledge, it is also the case that knowledge brings more suffering. In fact, the entire path of return to God is a path of suffering. But there is a point in which the suffering changes from a suffering that seems incoherent and unjust, unfair, externally caused and therefore blamable, and in which one can have judgments about a world that has caused the suffering, to the realization and internalization that we are the cause of our own suffering, and that we have caused it in order to turn it into knowledge. And it is then that the knowledge turns into love. And the love that has now changed from its lower form as desire, the love produces yet another kind of suffering. Particularly when the love is recognized in its true form as the unseen yet palpable manifestation of God. It is then that the love creates the suffering of our having been forgetful of this love, of having been unfaithful to God. And the pain of recognition of how many subtle ways we may still be unfaithful to God. And so the cleansing that we must go through in our internal process of examining our consciousness brings us to ever deeper levels of our own self-caused pain and the pain that we have caused to others without realizing it in the arrogance of the ego. It's in that self-examination that proceeds as a result of the knowledge that love confers upon us, that we are gradually allowed to re-enter the presence of God, and the pain turns to wonderment. And then finally to joy. But in this process of ascension through all the levels of consciousness that have gradually become denser and denser, we see the roots of the pain. in those thoughts that have subtly separated us from the source of our being. But the first separations seem exalted, they seem sublime, because we separate from the source of absolute being first into those archetypal forms that seem divine, that seem expressions of the celestial grandeur and majesty of God. And yet they have already removed us from the presence of the Most Holy. And gradually those archetypes become versions of themselves at lower and lower levels. And by perversion, we fall into the depths of the hell realm of Kali Yuga. And so our return must be a return to those higher and higher versions of our being until we have again reached the absolute that has no form, no localizable ability to be found as an object, but experiences again as a result of the reclaiming of the nothingness, the emptiness, the shunyata, that complete non-conceptual presence of the real that we are. Only then does the world that had been a world of pain become realized as the self-manifestation of God in every possible version of that infinite beauty that includes both darkness and light. And so the panorama of what had been a hell realm is revealed once again as a garden. But as the great Sheikh of Islam, Ibn Arabi, has written in a very beautiful poem and is already a metaphor in the Quran and in so much of Sufi poetry, we are in a garden in flames. And they are flames of destruction and hatred, but they are also the flames of love, because hatred and love are ultimately one. And the fire cleanses. And out of the cleansing of the fire of death, the garden blooms. And so we are in this mode of transformation in which we must die in every moment to the version that we were in the past moment through the knowledge of its lack, and then recognize that lack as itself the emptiness that is the golden doorway to the fullness of the supernal light and the wisdom and the power to grow the garden even in the midst of the flames. And this is the task of yogis at the end of time. We must be gardeners in the flames, of the flames, for the flames, and turn these flame trees into every form of beauty. And goodness through our unconditional love for the garden that we have been given and that we have mistreated and that therefore must undergo this metamorphosis, that includes our own bodily existential selves in the burning. And the burning takes place at every level. For some it is physical, for some it is emotional, for some it is spiritual, for some it must be all of the above. And the burning is ultimately the fire of love that is the eternal light of God that takes us beyond time, back into that eternal, blissful, untouchable, almighty power that is the author and the witness and the audience and the enjoyer and the transformer of the entire process that takes place not in time but in eternity, that seems to be transformed into time, but in fact we never leave the mind of God, because that is where all of this takes place. There is no other place. And ultimately, because it is a cleansing of the consciousness, there must be also a letting go of words, the final dust on the mind that must be released. Ibn Arabi again says that the 4 pillars of the process of spiritual transformation begins with silence. And as the silence is complete and internalized, it turns into seclusion. It turns into a solitude that transcends the need for physical separation. It is a seclusion and solitude that happens even in crowds and in communities. It is a seclusion of the heart with the beloved. But the 3rd pillar is what he calls hunger. And really that hunger is a loss of appetite for the enjoyment of the world. It's part of the emptiness. It's the refusal to satisfy those impulses of enjoyment that would lead to attachment to the dying world, so that it and oneself can die in peace into the eternal self. And so the hunger is also that desire that is the yearning for God, for release, for liberation. And this hunger, this emptiness that brings the fullness, is protected by the 4th pillar of vigilance, of not allowing any of the old sanskaras or habit patterns of return to ego consciousness to interfere with one's ascension. And the Sufis also say that there are 3 resonant dimensions of condensation, if you will, the densest being water, the water that is the water of life that flows, and the water that becomes time and change. But this water is also luminescent with the light of God that shines upon it, that spreads that light in all directions and illuminates the depths of the ocean of consciousness. But the light itself that comes from the source and manifests as that ocean is at a higher level of resonance, an octave removed from the water. That supernal light of God that gives birth to the archetypes and all the divine names and actions and functions that God performs both directly and through us, and through all the cosmic forces, geophysical and astrophysical. All of that is resonant with an even higher octave of knowledge, the knowledge that is the direct emanation of the mind of God. And beyond that, the mind that cannot be expressed, that cannot be known except through total absorption into that which can never be known by another, for there is no other. It is on this journey of remembrance, the Sufis call it zikr, but every religion has this understanding of remembrance, prayer, contemplation. Until we realize that we are that prayer, we are that remembrance, we are not someone who remembers something, but it is that wheel of remembrance itself that is turning and spiraling back into the vortex of the source from which we have come and back to which we now return. And in that contemplation, we shed all that was temporary and unreal and part of the cosmic dream, and return to the dreamer with thankfulness and with the fullness of the yearning to consummate our love for the lost beloved, who was veiled by our own inability to perceive the overwhelming power of the light that would wash out the illusion of our existence were we to see it clearly. And thus one cannot see the face of God and live as a separate ego. But in the seeing, one becomes again what cannot be seen, but which turns out to be nothing other than the blindness of the self that is blinded by its own infinite light from which it has been born. And so we are born, we die, we are resurrected, and we use the knowledge of this cosmic process in order to compassionately uplift those who have not yet gained the knowledge, because they are not yet ready for the blindness that comes from the lifting of the veil, and not yet ready to see what only that blindness can reveal. And that revelation is our liberation from suffering. because the suffering is the nature of the veil itself. I think I've spoken enough, and I will return to silence. But because my function is to answer questions, I'm sure there will be some, and I will be glad to be able to serve, because really the only function now that remains for all of us is that of service. And that service is the way that we make amends and expiate our sins from this and all the previous lifetimes that have brought the world into its present condition, in which we are all accomplices and which we now have the duty to restore to its perfection. Namaste. Go ahead, Purusha.
Thank you so much, Shunyamurti. And welcome to everyone who's joining us online as part of our virtual community. We have people tuning in from France, the Philippines, Australia, Costa Rica, the US, Canada, Israel, Spain, Germany, India, the UK, Ireland, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, South Africa, and Belgium. Our first question comes from Gerald. Gerald asks, should the desire for the big I not melt away all the tensions in the body as a kind of side effect? Does it mean my desire is not big enough when there are persistent tensions left? Do I care too much for the body, or is there just some kind of pranayama needed?
The tensions are projected into the body, but the tensions are in the soul. And the tensions are the result of the soul's intentions. And so as we meditate, our function is to translate the tensions back into the original intentions, because it's those intentions that separated us from God, which has created all of our tensions. It is when our vibrational frequency is out of sync with the vibrational frequency of God consciousness that we suffer. That's the real meaning of karma. The world is God's creative imagination in the fullness of its perfection. But as we are created within that dream of God, we create other imaginal worlds that are either resonant with that frequency and become microcosms of the macrocosm, or they become disharmonious. And in whatever way our vibrations, our intentions have become disharmonious with that of the cosmic intentionality of God, we suffer. And it's those tensions then that will lead to the knowledge that will free us from the ego shell and enable us to be liberated back into the tension-free bliss of God consciousness. But during the process of meditation, we are like a chick in a shell trying to peck its way out. And the very pecking from within creates more tension. But in addition to that, the shell itself is made up of the superego's resistance to our letting go, to our breaking free of the shell. It wants to keep us small and safe as the inner child that cannot fly and cannot leave its nest and wants to hide within that false identity. And so it is a tension that is produced both by the soul wanting to free itself of the ego and the superego collusion to resist growth because growth itself is and will be painful. But it will be a pain of flying and learning to manage the winds rather than the pain and suffering of the claustrophobic identification with the ego that is trapped in a form that has become too small for it. I hope that's of help to you.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Kieran, who asks, what is ADHD and how do I overcome it? Is it trauma? Can it be overcome? Can it be overcome and all of my karma without assistance, given that I haven't found a guru?
I have to say that I don't believe any of these psychiatric classifications, so they are meaningless to me. But if you are speaking of a consciousness that is in constant motion and that has an inability to hold its attention steady, especially in the steadiness that is required for meditation, then it comes from those same tensions that are caused approximately by the lack of loving attention in childhood, so that there was never an ability to feel stable, safe, peaceful, permitted to grow, to experiment, to wander, to discover, and to develop fully into the individuation of the self that is then able to recognize its universality. So if we want to heal that issue of consciousness, then we must give ourselves the right to know who we are. And in that conferring of that divine right, the attention will stabilize, and whatever symptoms have been caused by the vibration of consciousness that created the instability and volatility of the effects within one's emotional realm and one's relationality to others will also begin to dissipate, and there will be a clarity and coherence and cohesiveness of life energies that will enable one to control the divergences and deviations of consciousness and the manifestations of the impulses of the imagination in order to return the mind to its own source in God consciousness and be free of the ego shell that is the vibrating source of all of those instabilities. Are there any questions here in this space? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, our next question comes from Anders, who asks, when will Sat Yuga begin?
Whenever you're ready. As Jesus says, I think it's in the Gospel of Thomas, the kingdom of heaven is here before you, but you just don't see it. So the process, if you refer to the temporal process, will require a sufficient number of souls to go through this entire self-transformation in order to be able to vibrate at the frequency that will have the morphogenetic effect of planetary renewal. But the amount of apparent time that will take will depend completely on your own willingness to make that effort in such a wholehearted way that it will not be delayed. And if you do that, then it will manifest as everyone doing that, and it will come very quickly. Go ahead.
All right, the next question comes from Pilar, who asks, what is the best way to stop the physical sensations of anxiety?
Surrender to God. But that means all of your burdens, all of the worries that you have about life and about death. Recognize that we are in the hands of God and that we can do nothing about any of these issues and problems and worries about others. Everything is in the hands of the merciful one. And the more that we give ourselves to that merciful power of consciousness, the more that we can actually be of help and help others be relieved of their anxieties. But in the state of anxiety, you cannot be of any service. So anxiety is the state of someone who is on the Titanic after it has hit the iceberg, but who is still choosing to listen to the orchestra playing or gambling in the casino and not wanting to realize that they should be heading for the lifeboat already. And the anxiety is the alarm signal that when it gets strong enough will impel you to leave the sinking ship and find eternal life. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for the teaching. It was beautiful. And lately, I feel you've been mentioning archetype quite a bit in the last retreat. Several times it came up, and then again here. And it's very helpful to have this understanding of kind of how the archetype falls and how we can recognize it now, and the tools, literally, on how to raise that. In terms of like understanding what is an archetype, you've been gracious in helping us see that. How does one discover those and not imaginarize it and go out and find a book on archetypes, but rather understand more of these patterns that are being lived out so that one can identify them and explore them and understand the hidden aspects and gain that knowledge?
Think of what you love in another, and think of what you love in the world, and think of the kind of world you would love to live in, and think of the kind of people you would like to be around. Wouldn't they be virtuous, noble beings, magical beings, beings of great divine love and mercy and compassion and wisdom, and beings who were able to negotiate life in a state of grace, without fear, without desire, without projection. So it is the highest possible version of yourself that you can imagine, that you now have to wear as the clothing of your soul, until that appearance in the world enables you to recognize the source from which those archetypal and sublime feelings that come from leading a noble life will enable you to return to. The source of the archetype is always still internally embedded within the archetype itself, so that it is always pointing you to true north. The archetype is the inherent intentionality of serving God in order to return to God by manifesting godliness in the world. Okay.
This question comes from Oscar, who asks, what is an archangel, such as Gabriel or Michael, from a non-dual perspective? Most grateful for any answer.
The angels and the archangels are those levels of consciousness that we pass through on the way to God consciousness. And some who reach those levels of, let's say, archetypal realization of the power of consciousness to uplift others, to save, to heal, to give messages from God, and to deliver visions that will enable others to have faith in God. Those beings who have reached those levels will take on those functions. And so those functions are being fulfilled. And those functions, in fact, are what are enabling more and more beings to return to God and to have the faith and the willpower to overcome the negativity in the ego and to ascend into the fullness of the light. So they are part of the cosmic functions of God that are, in a sense, deputized or delivered as emergent properties that can be personalized, but in fact are attributes and archetypal attributes at that of God's saving power. Durga.
Thank you. You mentioned this metaphor, garden in flames, and that our task is to create a garden in the flames. That's not physically possible, so how would you expand more on that metaphor? Because I see fire is what fertilizes everything, but it cannot be simultaneous, so what
Sure. That's because you're under the illusion that there is such a thing as time. But for God, there is no time, and therefore everything really is simultaneous, even though it seems to unfold for one who is within the dream in the form of time. But in fact, the future is here now, just as Sat Yuga is here now, but not fully manifest. But if your third eye is open, you will see it is becoming more and more manifest as the flames of destruction get stronger. And so the garden is in fact being revived by the flames. And so for one who is in God consciousness, both gardens and flames are visible at the same time.
Thank you. Now,
okay, go ahead.
No, it actually makes sense that with all this cataclysm or whatever, people is actually making more gardens, like everyone. A lot of people I know is restarting their own gardens.
That's true. Probably too late at this point, but still it's a good effort. I want to read a poem that I actually brought by the great Sheikh Ibn Arabi that includes that line, because I think it summarizes a lot of what I was trying to convey this morning. It's a poem, it's the 11th poem in a book of poetry that he wrote called the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, which is the interpreter of desires. And this is a translation by an academic professor named Michael Sells, who I think has produced an excellent translation. Gentle now, doves of the thornberry and moringa thicket, don't add to my heartache your sighs. So let me stop with that verse. He is sitting in a garden where there are different trees, thornberry and moringa, and these trees are, the thornberry is an herb for purification, and the moringa is a medicinal tonic. So these two factors that are necessary, the cleansing and the awakening of the will for the ascension and the suffering that will bring, the doves are already cooing the message that one must eat of these herbs and add to one's heartache yet another dimension of pain. So, gentle now, doves of the thornberry and moringa thicket, don't add to my heartache your sighs. But they are the projection of his own sighs, are they not? Gentle now, or your sad cooing will reveal the love I hide, the sorrow I hide away. And in every soul there is hidden sorrow that must be revealed in the process of the contemplation of the self. I echo back in the evening, in the morning echo, the longing of a love-sick lover, the moaning of the lost. All the ego is in its life is an echo of a deeper pain and sadness of its lost relationship to the beloved. And all of our lives are simply a symptom of lovesickness. In a grove of tamarisks, spirits wrestled, bending the limbs down over me, passing me away. And so he is living and dying constantly in the wrestling of the spirits within him, of good and bad, the Yetzer HaTov, the Yetzer Hara, to use the Kabbalistic expression. And he is suffering in this wrestling with the angels and with the demons, Yisrael, the one who wrestles with God. They brought yearning, breaking of the heart, and other new twists of pain, putting me through it. Who is there for me in Jam, and the stoning place at Minah? Who for me at Tamarisk Grove, or at the way station of Naaman? These are all places in Islamic history and mythology of testing, of a stoning ground and a desert and a place of desolation and a place where one's nobility is tested. Hour by hour they circle my heart in rapture, in love ache, and touch my pillars with a kiss. As the best of creation circled the Kaaba, which reason with its proofs called unworthy, and kissed the stones there, and he was the Natik. And what is the house of stone compared to a man or a woman? Now here, unless you know the life of Ibn Arabi, you won't understand the meaning of this. But Ibn Arabi was a man who grew up in Spain, in Al-Andalus. And he became a great sheikh there, but later traveled to Mecca, because this is where you make the great Hajj, the pilgrimage. But when he arrived at the Kaaba, he said, "What am I doing here? Why should I be kissing a stone? This is all idol worship." And he was a very devout Muslim, but he recognized that this was only a sign, a symbol of God. But God is not a dead black stone. God is that which is unreachable by the mind. And yet, when Ibn Arabi contemplated the meaning of the Kaaba and the circumambulation of the stone, he came alive. The stone that was his own heart came alive in surrender to the power of God. And so as he kissed the stones there, he became the Natik, which is the one who speaks the word of God. He became the speaker of the power of God's presence at the very center of Islamic culture, in that vortex that finds its source at the Kaaba stone. They swore, and how often, that they'd never change, piling up vows. She who dyes herself red with henna is faithless. A white-blazed gazelle is an amazing sight, its red dye signaling, its eyelids hinting, pasturing between breastbones and innards. Marvel, a garden among the flames. Okay, so he is recognizing that all of life, all of the beauties, all of the experiences have only brought a greater yearning for that which cannot be embodied, for that which is unseen. The stone can only represent the beauty of God that can only be seen when our own stony nature has been dissolved. So, marvel, a garden among the flames. My heart can take on any form. A meadow for gazelles, a cloister for monks, for the idol's sacred ground, Kaaba for the circling pilgrim, the tablets of the Torah, the scrolls of the Quran. I profess the religion of love. And wherever love's caravan turns along the way, that is the faith I keep. And so it is a declaration that one must be loyal not to one's religion or one's concept of God, but to go beyond all concepts, all forms, all words, all signs of God, which all of us are, unto God itself, and settle for nothing less. And so the flames that burn away the ego are the same flames that reveal the garden.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that beautiful poem, Shunya. We have a question from Ken, who was with us on our online, our live stream retreat recently. Ken asks, as Kali Yuga is part of the universal cycle of creation and destruction, has all of the suffering not been inevitable? Can we reasonably harbor any distaste toward the apparently inescapable darkness?
No, it's not something to have distaste for. We must realize the beauty in the darkness itself. It has a kind of beauty. And in fact, why do people go to films that show destruction? People love to see the Terminator and the Predator and all of those films that magnify destruction of the world. That's what it makes a blockbuster these days. So we love the beauty of destructiveness. And the ego that has become inclined toward that beauty must now be nourished by it and recognize that the source of that suffering is our own recognition of our immortality that cannot be affected by blood or death or torture or torment of any kind, and proves the victorious nature of God in the very moment of the collapse of all that God had given us to sustain life. It's in that ultimate test of faith that we gain redemption.
This teaching and the poem perhaps describing some of the gardening happening within, but I would like to get your receive the blessings of your insights. So there's this tremendous pressure that can perhaps be like a fire. Right? It's burning away, and a pressure that let's say that the thought that came to mind was it's like the pressure of the carbon being transformed right, into what is a diamond, you know? And that feels like a turning, you know, churning, but a very dense pounding. And I recognize when you were speaking just now that the destruction that I have totally adored is the destruction of the ego. So is this that I am feeling within, is this the destruction of ego being destroyed by the love for God. And I think at the end of the meditation, you asked, can the finite or the process, I'm not sure really how you said it, be contained without being the nothingness. And I think this is what I'm witnessing, is that there's no containing this from any level of body or process or prana or even vijnana.
It's not meant to be contained. Let me approach what you're talking about from another perspective, which is that of, I would say, the central miracle story that is shared by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And this is actually the story of Joseph in the Bible. Joseph was the favorite of Jacob, the father, the patriarch. And because he was the favorite, all of the other of the 12 sons had envy of him. And as a result of their envy, they colluded to get rid of him, and they threw him in a well, hoping he would be killed. Through a number of events, he survived. He was brought to Egypt. There he had to suffer even more, a false accusation that caused him to go to prison. And in prison, he gradually gained a reputation as a dream interpreter for other prisoners, and then for the warden and for others. Eventually, the Pharaoh had some very distressing dreams that none of his counselors could answer, and he was very upset and said, "Is there no dream interpreter in my kingdom who can help me?" Gradually, the word got around that there was this Hebrew slave in the prison that could probably help him, and they brought him out, and he interpreted the dreams accurately. The Pharaoh was at peace and did what was necessary to keep the kingdom from the plague, the famines that were imminent, and he was then made the Grand Vizier or whatever title it was. And the same droughts at that point were causing the Israelites back in Canaan to need to come to Egypt to ask for help for some of the grain that the Egyptians were storing as a result of Joseph's wisdom. Well, so the 12 or the 11 brothers who had tried to kill him come to Egypt and ask for help, and they see that the person they must ask help from is Joseph. And Joseph has the power to do anything he wants to them. And he forgives them. You see, that's the miracle of forgiveness. Now, when that is explained by the commentaries, particularly by Ibn Arabi, it is said that what Joseph had that no one else had was iron in his soul. He was able to suffer all of the things he had to go through and yet retain that power of goodness and forgiveness that he was able to then employ when it was necessary. And it had miraculous effects, including Jacob back in Canaan, who had gone blind, was able to return to his sight when he got Joseph's shirt back, that he recognized the smell of his son, and he began to be able to see again. So these miracles are produced by the pressure that Joseph felt in his gut and his soul from all the suffering that he went through, and being able to go through it without anger or without any sense of injustice or unfairness, and retain his faith in God and goodness and be able to express it at the moment when it was being tested. That pressure required him to turn the iron in his soul into gold and into a diamond, the kind of pressure you're talking about. And so I think it is all the suffering in your life, from birth and before, that you had to deal with and put into your gut, that is transforming and metamorphosing into another alchemical element that will enable you to be able to then manifest the healing medicine and the philosopher's stone, the diamond mind, and heart, and the ability to use the wisdom and the love you have gained through your own realization of God's forgiveness and mercy to confer that to others. And so that pressure will soon be a spring that will be released as a fountain of compassionate love that will heal the world.
Our next question comes from Hash, who asks, how to be authentic in the midst of other people without an ego? In other words, how to express facial expression for someone accurate without an inner picture of yourself or ego. Thank you. I think this was also in reference to the perversion explanation you were giving.
I think it's only when you are without a self-image, when there is nothingness and therefore no projection, that you see the other as they really are. And if you see the other as they really are, you cannot but see the face of God. Because all each individual is a sign of God. You could say we are each a hieroglyph. We are each an archetypal form that is a letter in the alphabet of God. And therefore, all of us create the signs that, when correctly interpreted, become the book of Revelation itself, which is the whole meaning of the world as the book of God that is the destiny of creation that will ultimately come to manifest the glory of God in its final denouement as the singularity. It is that which enables us to arise back into our original nature. So what will happen is not something that you must prefabricate or prepare how to have an expression. There will be nothing unnatural like that. Whatever is expressed will come directly out of the joy of seeing the presence of God in whoever and whatever appears to you. Tara.
Thank you, Shunya. I also had a question about this perversion. I found it very interesting, and when you said there's actually a positive side to this as well, and I was wondering, I was contemplating, is that like the performativity paradox that we talk about? Because I felt that pain when you mentioned the perversion of changing faces, and I find it painful when I see that and when I behave that way. But then when you mentioned there was a positive version, I was trying to wonder what would that look like.
Well, it would mean showing the other more positive versions of yourself, the higher, the more noble, the more angelic, and then realizing that they are indeed true faces of your being that you had not yet revealed to yourself. And so in the revelation and mercy of giving your best to the other, you are also then giving it back to yourself. And the other's love that will come from that gift that you are giving will also be the other's recognition of your goodness and your archetypal divine nature, which will uplift you into an even higher state of love. And if that love isn't projected on the other who is loving you for that goodness, but is returned to God, then it will be the elevator that will take you back to the penthouse from which the world will be seen in its true divine nature and reborn as such. Kuber.
Thank you. Is suffering really necessary, or if one adopted the Tao, the way of Tao, in which one flows and has no resistance, even before one awakens, wouldn't that still lead you, because you would then just follow the will of God naturally, which is to reveal himself, and for this particular manifestation to find its source without suffering?
Let me ask you, Kuber, are you following the Tao?
No.
Are you free of suffering?
No.
Okay then, apparently it's necessary. You see, in order to adopt the Tao, you already have to have gone through the suffering that has produced the knowledge so that you can get the Tao. If you don't grok the Tao through having turned suffering into wisdom, the Tao is just a concept. You can't be in the flow unless you have turned yourself into the water of life that has become light and knowledge itself, and then the power of God's mind, because that's what the Tao really is. And so you can't just, pretend you have it. You have to earn it. And the earning of it means going through the suffering. However, knowing that the suffering is the ladder to God, you can actually go through the suffering with joy. And that's actually the meaning of the symbol of the crucifixion. The whole point is that Christ did not suffer on the cross. And one can approach all the sufferings of life with great joy and bliss because it is the means of returning to God. And therefore it's not suffering at all. That's the veil. The suffering itself is bliss. But to know that, you have to be in the Tao. But thank you for your question. Is there any other? Okay, Purush.
Thank you, Shunya. We have a question from Shaken, who says, Namaste, Shunya. Some sages say that eventually one must even drop the concept of God. From my impression, it seems that in Buddhism, such a concept doesn't exist. Can you please shed some light on the dropping of the concept of God, as well as in relation to the fact that still sages and masters keep using it?
Well, first of all, you're wrong that the concept of God doesn't exist in Buddhism. Quite the contrary. In fact, there are many scenes in which one or more of the Hindu gods come to Buddha and pass the torch to him and recognize Buddha as the new manifestation of God. And you often will see the pictures of Buddha protected by the cobras, the serpents, those powers that once they are mastered become transformed from demonic, poisonous, venomous beings into protective forces. You see all of the accoutrements and symbols of God that were there in the previous Vedic culture being transferred into, given to the Buddha and the Buddha nature, and all of those beings who come along with Buddha, the Dakinis, and all of those angelic and delightful beings who are dancing in the Buddha heavens that are also revealed by Buddha. So what we have is not the elimination of the concept of God, but the transfer of the concept of God into the concept of man. And so Buddha is man realizing himself as God. And by man, of course, I mean human. Man or woman is irrelevant. But it is the human nature divinized, which is the same symbol as Christ for Christianity. Christ and Buddha are the same. Christ and Krishna are the same. All of the avataric figures have the same symbolic significance, although some may be of lower or higher degree of the realization and manifestation of that nature. So it is not an atheistic religion. It's a dharma in which our duty is to realize the Buddha nature, which is the nature of God, as the self, and then, of course, indeed go beyond any concept of God to realizing the truth of God and to be that, not to think about God, to be that and to live that from the heart. And that is the same as in every religion. Okay.
This question comes from Sheila from India. She asks, could you please elaborate on how to go to sleep still in self-realization, as you mentioned in the awakening talk, while speaking of intensifying the practice without interruption?
Well, that question will answer itself once you're in the state of self-realization. Until you're in the state of self-realization while awake, and we're talking about the Turiya state, until you are in it while awake, you can't expect to be able to be in it when you fall asleep. But the wakefulness is the wakefulness of the consciousness that no longer identifies with the body. And therefore, whether the body is awake or asleep, it is always part of the cosmic dream. And you have to have awakened from that dream in order to then be awake in the dream or the dreamless sleep of the body-mind. So it is a process that will emerge naturally once the mind has been silenced and one is asleep to the ego while awake. Then one will be awake while the ego sleeps. Okay.
We have a question from Ananta, who's asking, there's some confusion, there's some talk in the chat, and wants to clarify if you're saying that we're moving now into Sat Yuga, or at least heading in that direction. We're not transitioning from Kali Yuga to Dwapar Yuga.
Oh no, we're not going to Dwapar, but we are in what's called Sangam Yuga. And Sangam Yuga has two parts to it. Sangam means the confluence. It's the point where Kali Yuga flows into Sat Yuga, but there is a period in which that interim, that transition unfolds in time as both a destruction and the rebirth of the new golden age, let's say, after the fall of the Iron Age. So the first half of Sangam Yuga occurs within what astrologically is called the Piscean Age. The second half happens in the Aquarian Age. We have now entered into the Aquarian Age, which is the second half of Sangam Yuga. And so now a new dispensation, a new offering of God of an accelerated path to liberation is being gifted to us, along with the acceleration of the destructive forces in the world. And so it is a very blessed moment in which our arising to the highest states of consciousness are accessible to those who wholeheartally yearn for it and are able to let go of their attachment to the age that is dying and attaching all of their love to God and to that which is eternal, will function as angels and archangels in these final moments when the world will be depopulated and cleansed completely and purified and prepared for the next age. So we are in a transition now that is accelerating in both polarities of extreme darkness and extreme light. And if we choose the light, then we will see that, and we will experience and know the power of that light in a more direct way than we could ever have imagined. Okay. Priyaji.
Thank you, Shunya. I really appreciated this teaching. And one thing I really resonated with was that more knowledge creates more suffering in a way, because I see that understanding what has been going on and what needs to be let go of is creating more suffering in a way because it's painful. But then I had a question, because you mentioned with the poem that in every soul there's a hidden sorrow that needs to be brought up, and I was wondering if you can clarify the difference between finding this sorrow, which what I understand is the separation from God, which in comparison to getting more knowledge of what I see as the causes of being separated from God and not being stuck in ego's grief of what needs to be let go of, and more just bringing up that sorrow. I'm not sure if that's clear, but...
Your question is how to bring it up?
No, like the difference between bringing up that sorrow in the soul and not being lost in the ego's grieving of what needs to be let go of.
Okay. Well, again, there are two phases, and you have to first go through the phase of the ego's sorrow that comes from its loss of its mother, in its biological mother, and its loss of childhood. Childhood was paradise. And so people don't want to grow up. They don't want to individuate and differentiate from the family system. They don't want to let go of all of the attributes of their own ego that they have mimetically taken in from the biological family and have made their own identity. But it's a false identity. And the pain first of recognizing the falseness and the obsoleteness of one's identity as an ego that is rooted in a past that is long gone and that keeps one in a state of psychological immaturity and deadness, that has to be dealt with first. And then one comes alive to one's soul nature. And then one realizes that the soul itself has lost God in its sutratmic cyclical reincarnations of its versions of itself from one life to another. And that's a whole other level of suffering. And then the separation of soul from Atman must be dealt with. So you have to go through all of these different levels of suffering. But until you've cleansed the ego's subconscious suffering, you can't get to the superconscious suffering that the soul is harboring. Okay?
Question from Lucas, who asks, is the ego what's responsible for the devil in religion?
The ego is the devil, yes. And that's because the same power that is God, that is divine, supreme love that gives creation manifestation in the first place, at the ego level turns into desire. And that desire is narcissistic, it's possessive, it's territorial, it justifies aggression and rejection and judgment and war and death in the name of goodness, all of that. So yes, the ego is the demonic force. And that shouldn't be, turned into some external devil that you fear. It's the devil within that's the cause of one's suffering. But that devil is nothing other than the perversion of divine love. And once we turn desire back into the form of love, then all is healed. Parvati.
Thank you for your teachings. I had a question back from when you talked about the 4 pillars, the silence, the solitude, hunger, and then vigilance, and was wondering if you could talk more about the vigilance in this process of cleansing.
Talk a little louder, I can't hear you. The vigilance is?
If you could just talk more about the process, or what is vigilance in the process of this cleansing that has to happen of consciousness, and is that sort of a strength coming out of the knowledge from suffering?
Okay, this is a very deep subject that you're asking, and it's actually an integral part of the next retreat that we're going to be doing. And it's much too deep and elaborate a subject to really go into now because we only have a few minutes left in this satsang. And it is perhaps, the ultimate question of how does that vigilance lead us to liberation. So rather than try to give you a bite-sized answer that won't satisfy your hunger, I would ask you to be patient and fast for a while from the need for an answer until we can feast on it in the next retreat. Are there any other local space questions before we adjourn? Any burning questions? Or gardening questions? Okay, then let's. Oh, yes, you have? Go ahead, Amrita.
Will you also be talking about hunger? Because that was one of my questions. So.
Yeah, we'll be talking about all of that and more regarding how we ascend step by step. What is the process? What do we have to know? What pain do we have to go through? What do we have to let go of? We'll be, going through it together so that we can be free. That's the whole purpose of the retreat. But to go through this retreat, to understand this, not just conceptually, you have to have gained complete self-discipline over your impulses, over your imagination, over your sanskaras, and over your ego's fear of the unknown. And so you're not even ready for the retreat and for this knowledge until you have done that work on your own. Let's have one last question.
Okay, the last question goes to Prema, who asks, when there is no remembrance of dreams for several nights in a row, but one wakes up feeling very rested, what is happening?
Well, if one's waking up rested, then it means that either there was no particular distressing information that you needed to process in a dream, because you were acting accurately in the waking state, or else it was so deeply buried in denial that it hasn't come up to the point of being ready to disturb your sleep with a distressing dream. But in either case, enjoy the rest, but don't assume it's permanent. So I thank you all for your questions and for the energy and the integrity and the sincerity with which you are encountering this knowledge that is God's gift to us all, and that each of us must process in our own way and through our own experience and our own suffering and our own release of suffering once we have gained access to the Tao, and our ability to turn that wisdom into the ability to help others to be free of their suffering, because it's in that state that we will finally expiate all of our debts that we owe to society, to God, and ultimately to the self. But often we cannot do this without creating more suffering for others, Because even our growth and our process of becoming more God conscious will create suffering in others who will feel that they're being left behind. And a lot of you know that your biological families don't understand why you've joined an ashram, or why you're on a spiritual path, or why you no longer relate to them as mommy and daddy like you did it when you were a child, that they still want you to do, and why you are now living as a different being that they can't recognize, with values and vocabulary and with a worldview that they cannot even begin to understand or want to. And that change is even magnified more when you are put in a position of teaching and giving information, or even mandating processes that will cause pain in the surgical process of cutting away what remains of the ego and opening up in its third eye the blind spot that has caused it not to be able to see its own godliness within, that can only be opened through the pain of the piercing of the ego's denial. And it is the sacredness of this pain and suffering that we must go through, that we must share, that we must often inflict, and that we must expiate, that really symbolizes and summarizes all of our relationships together. And together we must all rise into that level in which our pain is metamorphosed into the bliss of our eternal and true nature. Namaste.
Namaste. Namaste. Thank you to Shunyamurti for sharing with us today this incredible wisdom, and the guided meditation and the questions and answers. We're very appreciative. And we want to thank all of you who are joining us today. There were over 200 people with us today at this live stream, and we could really feel the reverberations of the energy field, and your participation is very much appreciated. And we want to give a special thanks to our members who help support us, as well as our past retreatants who are all around the world, and everyone who joined us for the online retreat that we concluded 2 weeks ago. I have a few announcements that I'd like to give. The first one is about this online retreat that we concluded 2 weeks ago. It was an incredible first ever experience for us. It was like one of these live streams, but set over 7 days with practices for you at home, and was an incredible space to share art and to share with one another via encounter groups where we all got to join and see each other and talk and listen. It was a very beautiful retreat filled with teachings of heart-opening wisdom, mind-blowing, transformational nature of dispensation, and we're very grateful for it. And we very much encourage you now to purchase these teachings, which are available to you, and you can find the link in our description of this video. We want to also let you know that our members section is now open at the higher tiers to anyone around the world who would like to join. This was something that previously one had to actually come to the ashram to participate in. But now, if you're interested, you can subscribe to our higher level members section, also available in the description. And this will include daily teachings that are given by Shunyamurti, and book groups and other things to help you keep up to date with everything that's going on here at the ashram, as well as an encounter group where we can share together as a group, everyone who's participating in our virtual community, and join us here. As well as in the highest level, recordings from our retreats and events that happen during the time of your membership. So we highly encourage you to check that out. As Shunyamurti mentioned, we're also going into another live stream retreat in May. We've finished the dying world. We awakened in the dying world, which was the topic of our last retreat, and now we'll be ascending to the age of Aquarius, which is the name of the retreat, and the subtitle is The Dispensation of the Absolute. We strongly encourage you to join us, to take part in this community, and to use these teachings to nourish yourself, to recharge you in this very difficult time of tribulations. And we want to say that while we're in this quarantine, while the world is in lockdown, we're doing our best to put out more teachings, to create a Clips channel, and to create other ways that you can engage with us. But we rely heavily on your support. We've had to close our doors to the public because of the virus, but we're now opening our virtual doors for all of you. And we would highly appreciate any support that you can give if you feel like you've benefited from these teachings. And there are a number of ways you can do that, obviously through the member section, through joining our events online, but also through a number of other ways. Just today, we've launched a Patreon page, which will help you if you're interested in giving a monthly contribution. You can do so through the Patreon page. That link will be in the description. This is very helpful to us to continue to increase the quality of these offerings. Believe it or not, this takes a lot of technical know-how and support. We have a team that's very dedicated to giving that. But we also need to continue to maintain equipment and to buy new cameras, audio recording equipment, mixers, and many, many other things that I won't go into. But every little bit helps us to continue to put out these teachings and to improve. So you can make a payment through a monthly contribution through the Patreon page, but you can also just go directly to our website, the donate page on our website, and make a donation through that. We greatly appreciate your support and your participation, and we hope that you'll continue to join us for all of these live stream satsangs, that you'll continue to watch all of the videos that we're putting out, and to join us for our next retreat, and to become a member if you feel called. So that's all we'll share today. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure. Namaste.